Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Silver, but today I'm going to be gold so that I match the color of Cleric, which is the focus of the video today. In this video, I'm going to give you 7 different tips for playing a Cleric in mod 17 and above. Most of them are for the Devout paragon, but there are a couple that are for Arbiter. The original plan was to do 5 tips for each paragon, but after trying to think for a few days, I couldn't think of enough for Arbiter, so I changed it to 7 because 7 and 17 sounds a little bit better. The first tip for the Devout paragon is to pay attention to the free outgoing healing bonuses that clerics have and use them. The 2 main ones being the Blessing of Light at will and then Exaltation Encounter. This is especially important if your outgoing healing base percentage is pretty low. But even if you do have a decent amount of outgoing healing, it's still really great to use these bonuses. Blessing of Light gives you an additional 10% outgoing healing that can be increased to 15% if you use the artifact modification on your offhand. Exaltation is, I believe, 20% outgoing damage and healing bonus. Speaking of Blessing of Light, get in the habit of casting Blessing of Light in between everything else that you do. Every time you heal someone, throw in a right click. And if it's about to wear out, it lasts about 5-10 seconds or something like that. If it's about to wear out, cast it again, just so that you have that bonus ready whenever you need it. It's a quick cast, like a second, less than a second cast time, for you to get 10 to 15% bonus outgoing healing, which is super helpful. So get in that habit. The same way Blessing of Battle used to be, you always wanted to keep it at, what was it, like 3 stacks or something like that? I don't even remember anymore, but keep that bonus up. You can tell if it's up or not because you'll have this like glowing sunshine aura around your head. One last thing about Blessing of Light, it's also really good for passively, well, not exactly passively, but generating action points either out of combat or when you're not doing anything else in combat. It gives you 2% of your action points every cast, so if your action points are empty, yes, it will take you 50 casts to get to full, but it is a good help for generating action points. Having better outgoing healing will lead to better divinity management, which is a problem that a lot of people have whenever they're trying to play healer on their clerics. And it's a problem I had as well until I, took the leap away from power and into outgoing healing, which I'll talk a little bit more about a little bit later. Tip number 2 for Devout is don't overuse Healing Word. It's a great encounter, and it's really useful in certain situations, namely whenever your party is split all around the room, or around the map or whatever, and you can't heal more than like 2 of them with Bastion at a time. In that case, Healing Word is extremely useful, but the downside of it is that it costs a lot of divinity. There is a feat to make it last a long time, but it only heals in a certain interval, so it's very possible that people can still die even if they have Healing Word on them. The first mistake I made whenever I first started trying to play Heal Cleric again was I used Healing Word all the time, and so I never had any divinity. It's a good encounter, but don't overuse it. Tip number 3. Speaking of divinity, channel divinity anytime you have a free moment in combat, especially after you heal someone with a divinity costing encounter. There is a feat that, if you choose it, gives you bonus divinity whenever you use channel divinity after healing someone with an encounter power that costs divinity. Did I say divinity enough in that sentence? I don't think so. Let's say it some more. So divinity management on a cleric is more difficult than on Paladin, and is a totally different resource than Warlock, but I would say still more difficult than Warlock. But anyway, I went into Cleric from healing on Paladin, where you didn't have to channel divinity very much at all. In fact, only whenever you had a Prayer of Opportunity proc for that burst regen of divinity. On Cleric, there is not something like that. And I found myself wishing for something like that on many occasions whenever I was struggling with my divinity management. But at the time that I was wishing for that, I was not really using Channel Divinity. I felt like I should always be doing something in combat. Like using my at-wills to attack the mobs because I don't have any damaging encounters most of the time. But it's actually more beneficial for you if you use some of that time to Channel Divinity. Don't completely ignore doing damage, just don't focus on doing damage whenever you're not healing, unless that's what you're into. Because there's a couple clerics I know who can do decent damage while healing, but That's not what I like to do, and that's not what I'm good at. Speaking of divinity management a little bit more, the other thing other than using channel divinity in combat that really made me understand divinity management more is having better outgoing healing. I know I mentioned this a little bit earlier, like probably 30 seconds ago, but that is really a huge part of it. There are class features that increase your outgoing healing depending on how much divinity you have or how close you are to the target. There is Exaltation, there is Blessing of Light. I keep wanting to call it Blessing of Battle, but that was already 2 mods ago that it was called that. But the point is there are so many outgoing healing bonuses at your disposal, and that's not even talking about companions, which clerics have the option of having 4 of the outgoing healing companions slotted. Maybe 5, I didn't check if that was actually possible, but we'll go with at least 4, which is, if they're all legendary, already 40% outgoing healing base. Then there's also the White Dragon Glyphs that give you 10% bonus outgoing healing whenever their ability is active, which is about a third of the time. So it's very possible to have over 100% outgoing healing temporarily. So if you find yourself running out of divinity, spending lots of bastions of health over and over in order to keep people topped off, namely the tank, if you have to use more than a couple of bastions to heal an average tank from really low hit points, you might want to consider increasing your outgoing healing. Of course, also having decent critical severity and critical strike will help with that too. Tip number 4. Do not be afraid to use Divine Glow. At first glance, Divine Glow doesn't really do anything, but it actually gives you a little bit of divinity regeneration. This is something that I slot whenever I'm in a group that is going a little bit slower, the boss fights are taking longer, I'm having to heal more, and divinity management gets more and more difficult the longer the fight gets. Using Divine Glow makes it a little bit easier to keep up with that and get your divinity back a little bit faster. And tip number 5. Quick swapping powers in combat for different situations. This can be applied to Healing Word, Cleansing Touch, Divine Glow, Intercession. Those are pretty much the only 4 that I swap in and out, but Astral Shield could get thrown in there too if that's the kind of thing that you want to go for. But a lot of people just want to have one set of powers that they just stick to for an entire run, for an entire mod, for always, and they never really want to think about swapping them around to have a better experience. But in Tong in particular that I'm thinking of, swapping in Cleansing Touch in the final boss in order to cleanse the paralysis or the burns, and then quickly swapping back to another encounter power could actually make things a little bit easier. Yes, people tend to speedrun Tong nowadays, but if not everyone is that far into the game, not that far in game to do that, so in situations like that, it can actually be beneficial for you to take a couple seconds to swap your powers. Just make sure that nobody is in immediate danger of death before you do that. Because the last thing you want to do is go into your little power screen, swap out your power, and then exit out like, yeah, I'm ready to heal people, and then there's just a pile of death all around you, and your teammates are mad, and then they leave, and then you're sad, and then you quit. And that took a turn real fast. Tip number 5.5. I'm just going to shove this in here because it fits with the Healing Cleric, but it's not specific to the Healing Cleric, but it's still relevant. So, tip 5.5 is to show ally health bars, either after being hit recently or all the time. This is important because in combat, you might be familiar that the screen gets really cluttered. Of course, turning off the numbers and special effects is also an option, but if you don't want to do that, or if you want to do both, turning on ally health bars will make it a lot easier to see who has been hit, and you'll still be able to pay attention to the combat in front of you instead of having to look up and to the left to see how your allies are doing in your group in your little party section window thing. Personally, I have mine to show after being hit recently, but I've been contemplating changing it to always, at least for certain queued content like Tom, just so that I can always know whose health is at what point while still being able to pay attention to important mechanics. And now on to the Arbiter paragon. So tip number 6 is a very basic one, but one that is going to make a huge difference, and that is to choose the Sudden Verdict feat. This feat is so great for regenerating divinity and just getting the maximum damage bonus possible on your encounters and dailies. It procs really often, it has a 25% proc chance, and what it does is completely fills up your, what is that called? Judgment meter thing, with whatever judgment would be generated by your most recent attack. If you're running low on Divinity, you can get this to proc pretty quickly, and then bam, you've got like 40% of your Divinity back. Awesome! And tip number 7, Cleric DPS is a little bit clunky. There's a lot of build up to only a little bit of actual maximum effectiveness, and the best way to maximize your effectiveness is to know which powers benefit from which judgment type. Originally, it was kind of opposite. Whenever you had Burning Judgment, it would enhance Radiant powers, and when you had Radiant Judgment, it would enhance Burning powers, but it's now was changed to be the same. So when you use a Radiant power, it will consume all of your Radiant Judgment, and your Fire powers will consume Burning Judgment, but the powers themselves generate the opposite type. For example, Forgemaster's Flame is a fire power and it increases the Radiant Judgment, but consumes the Fire Judgment or Burning Judgment. It's a little tricky to get used to at first, and you really have to look at all the powers and learn which ones do what. It's pretty straightforward though, because the ones that do fire-related things, like, Forgemaster's Flame or Searing Javelin, are fire/burning related powers, and ones that have more light damage, like Daunting Light, will do radiant damage. Alright, well that is all 7.5 tips that I had for you today. I hope you found them a little bit useful and it helped you maybe understand your cleric a little bit more, or maybe shed light on something that you might not have known much about that will help you play better. But let me know in the comments, or if you have any cleric tips of your own, please feel free to share them in the comments as well. Just mention which path you're taking, healing or DPS, and comment your tips down below. As always, thank you so much for watching or listening or whatever, and I'll see you guys later. Okay, bye!